The morning began like any other clear sky wind, soft as breath across the valley. By noon, that breath had turned to heat. The smell of smoke reached the ranch before Thomas saw the flames. He was fixing the southern fence when the wind shifted, carrying a plume of gray over the ridge. Within minutes, the radio crackled wildfire near Baker Creek. All residents prepare for possible evacuation. Thomas looked toward the barn. The wolf, still limping, but stronger now, paced restlessly. The pack's howls echoed faint and distant from the high country. He whispered, "You can smell it too, huh?" Ash began to fall like snow. By evening, the ridge glowed red. The fire moved fast, fed by wind and dry grass. Thomas loaded what he could into his truck fuel cans, tools, feed. But the sheep, hundreds of them, crowded the lower pasture, terrified by the scent. He had no time to move them all. The power went out. The valley roared with wind. Flames crawled down the slope like living things. The air burned his lungs. Thomas ran to the barn. The wolf was awake. Hackles, raised eyes fixed on the ridge. When Thomas opened the door, it didn't retreat. It stared straight past him toward the pasture. For a moment, he thought the animal might bolt. Instead, it turned back toward him and gave a short, sharp bark, almost like a command. He followed its gaze. The sheep. Thomas grabbed his coat, coughing through smoke. "All right," he rasped. "Let's do this together." They ran. Out in the open, the fire's glow painted the sky blood orange. The flock had split, some pushing against the fences, others bolting uphill where the danger was worse. Thomas shouted, waving his arms. His guard dogs barked and circled, trying to turn the herd. Then, through the chaos, came a sound he didn't expect, a low, rising howl cutting through wind and panic. The wolf. The animals froze. Every sheep's head turned toward that voice, ancient and commanding. Thomas took the moment. He whistled sharply, driving them toward the safe canyon where irrigation lines formed a barrier of damp ground. The wolf loped alongside, limping but tireless, herding from the other side like she'd done it all her life. Flames leapt across the upper slope. Sparks rained down. Thomas's sleeve caught an ember. He slapped it out. The wolf coughed, eyes gleaming through smoke. They reached the canyon's mouth as a gust sent fire over the ridge. Thomas opened the irrigation gates. Water surged, flooding the trench. He drove the sheep inside, shouting until his voice broke. Then he turned and saw the wolf still outside, trapped behind a collapsing fence. "Damn it!" He sprinted back, heat blistering his skin. The wolf whined, paw tangled again, this time in broken, fladry wire, half melted by fire. He yanked at it, ignoring pain as sparks stung his hands. The wire snapped. The wolf stumbled free, and together they dove through the mud as a burning beam crashed behind them. Water hissed. Steam filled the air. When Thomas opened his eyes, they were both alive, soaked, shaking, lying side by side in the shallow ditch. The fire swept past, roaring overhead, but sparing the canyon. He coughed, laughed once, then fell silent. The wolf stood first, shaking off ash. It looked down at him, eyes reflecting both flame and moonlight. He whispered, "Guess we're even now." By dawn, the ridge was blackened. The valley smoked like a dying forge. Thomas rose slowly, every muscle aching. Around him, the flock grazed nervously on wet soil. The wolf limped to the edge of the canyon and howled. Another answered from far, far away. Thomas felt something break loose inside him, a weight he hadn't realized he carried. All the anger, all the fear that had ruled his life burned away with the ridge. He looked at the animal and said softly, "Go home." The wolf lingered, uncertain. Then it stepped closer and touched its muzzle briefly against his sleeve, just a brush, quick as wind, before turning toward the mountains. For a long time, Thomas watched until the gray shape disappeared into the pines. He didn't cry, but when the silence returned, it felt different, no longer empty, but alive. Days later, firefighters declared the blaze contained. News crews came filming the Black Hills and the ranch that somehow survived. Maria Santos from the Wood River Wolf Project arrived in a dust-covered truck, shaking her head in disbelief. You saved the whole herd, she said. Thomas shrugged. Didn't do it alone. She smiled gently. We heard reports. One of the wolves stayed behind during the fire. That true Thomas looked toward the ridge where new green shoots were already pushing through ash. Maybe he said. Maybe she was just reminding me what partnership means. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the sawtooths, the valley shimmered gold again. Thomas rebuilt the fence, leaving the fladry ribbons in place, not as warning, but as memory. Each red flag fluttered softly in the wind, like an old truce renewed. He paused, hands resting on the post, listening. Far in the distance, a single howl rose steady, clear, strong. He smiled. Sometimes, survival isn't about fighting nature. Sometimes it's about remembering we're part of it. Before that frozen night, Thomas Reed's world was built from repetition. Every dawn began with the same sound, the creak of his barn door, the bleating of sheep, the rattle of buckets as he fed the flock his father once tended. Thomas was 57, a rancher born into the red dust of Idaho's high desert. His hands carried the memory of frostbite and fence wire. His back bore the shape of decades spent bent over pastures. He wasn't a cruel man, but he lived by one belief passed down from generations before him: wolves don't belong near sheep. His ranch stretched across the rolling hills of Sun Valley, where the Sawtooth Mountains cut the horizon like the spine of a sleeping giant. Each season brought its own kind of hardship: blizzards in winter, drought in summer, and the quiet, invisible threat that stalked the edges of the land. For years, Thomas had measured his losses by what he found in the morning snow hoofprints that ended in chaos. Tufts of wool stained red, the silence of a missing lamb. He'd cursed the government for bringing wolves back. He'd hung more fences, bought guard dogs, even installed the bright red fladry lines that were supposed to keep predators out. But fear is a hard thing to fence. The Wood River Wolf Project had come to the valley 5 years earlier, a collaboration between biologists, conservationists, and local ranchers who wanted to prove that wolves and livestock could coexist. They taught non-lethal deterrence using sound, light, and motion to keep predators away without killing them. They brought in Anatolian shepherd dogs, trained range riders, and offered compensation for proven losses. To Thomas, it all sounded like wishful thinking. He'd attended one meeting once and left before the coffee cooled. You can't reason with hunger, he'd said. Still, he remembered the faces of the people in that room. Young volunteers with notebooks and passion in their eyes. An older woman named Maria Santos, a biologist who spoke gently about balance and patience. If we understand the wolf, she'd told the group, we protect more than sheep, we protect the story of this land. Back then, Thomas had rolled his eyes, but those words would come back to him echoing years later beside a trapped gray wolf trembling under the moon. The winter leading up to that night had been brutal. Snow had come early, burying fences and freezing troughs solid. Thomas worked long hours alone. His son had moved to Boise, and his wife Eleanor had passed 3 winters before. The house felt emptier each day, the radio his only companion. Sometimes he'd keep it tuned to the local station that aired updates from the Wood River Project, if only to argue back at it while he worked. On the day before the incident, a storm warning had rolled through the valley. Thomas had secured the barns and laid fresh straw for the ewes about to lamb. He checked the fences twice, the fladry lines whipping violently in the rising wind. As dusk fell, he'd poured himself a cup of black coffee and stood by the window watching the hills blur into snow. He told himself the wolves would stay in the timberline. They always did, until they didn't. That night, as sleet hissed against the roof and his sheep pressed close to one another for warmth, Thomas dreamed of running footsteps in the dark and woke to the real sound of howling across the valley. Hours later, he'd stand face to face with the creature that would upend everything he believed. But before that moment, before compassion ever entered his vocabulary, There was only the land, vast, harsh, and sacred. When Thomas Reed reached the northern pasture that night, the storm had already half buried the fence in snow. The lantern light wavered, throwing shards of gold across the ribbons of fladry that snapped and screamed in the wind. And there, just beyond the posts, lay the gray wolf. Its back leg was tangled tight in wire. Every time it struggled, the red flags flashed like blood against the white ground. The animal panted, hard breath steaming in the cold. One eye glinted yellow under the light, the other was half closed with exhaustion. Thomas's first thought was anger. "You finally got yourself caught," he muttered. For years he'd imagined this moment proof that the predator that haunted his fields could be stopped. He raised the rifle hand steady despite the chill. But the wolf didn't snarl. It whimpered, low, broken. The sound didn't belong to a monster, it belonged to something that wanted to live. He hesitated. The storm hissed louder, swallowing the valley. Snow gathered on the rifle barrel. For a long minute, Thomas stood between instinct and something he couldn't name. Then he lowered the gun. He spoke softly, as if to calm a spooked ewe. "Easy now. You're not gonna hurt me, are you?" The wolf's ears twitched. It blinked, chest heaving. Thomas crouched, inspecting the wire. It was tight, too tight to slip free. Blood had frozen around the metal. He tried to remember what the biologists had said at that meeting years ago: never approach a trapped predator alone. But there was no one else. The nearest neighbor lived 6 miles away, and the storm had cut the road. He tried calling the county ranger on his old radio static. He looked back at the animal. Its paw twitched weakly. Its eyes followed him not with rage, but with trust, born from desperation. He took off his gloves, reached for the wire cutters hanging on his belt. "All right," he whispered. "Let's see if I can fix what we humans broke." The moment his hands neared the wolf flinched and snapped teeth missing by inches. Thomas froze. Their breaths clouded the space between them. Then he noticed something. The wolf wasn't aiming to bite. It was warning, frightened, cornered. He moved slower this time, murmuring nonsense words the way he used to talk to lambs. "It's okay. Easy now." Easy. With each cut, the tension loosened. The wolf stopped trembling. When the final strand fell, the animal collapsed in the snow, leg shaking. Thomas expected it to run, but it didn't. It stayed there, sides rising and falling, too weak to stand. He looked back toward the house. It was a long walk through whiteout wind. The animal would never make it. He made a choice that would change everything. He lifted the tarp from his truck bed, wrapped the wolf carefully, and carried it 40 pounds of muscle fur and wildness across the frozen field. His arms burned, but he didn't stop until the barn light came into view. Inside, he laid the animal near the heater used for newborn lambs. He cut the tarp open. The wolf blinked once, groggy but alive. Thomas whispered, "Don't make me regret this." Outside, the storm howled through the valley, the same sound that used to fill him with hatred. But that night, it felt different, less like a threat, more like a witness. He sat on an overturned bucket, watching the creature breathe. For the first time in his life, Thomas Reed realized the line between predator and protector was thinner than the wire he'd just cut. He didn't sleep. At dawn, the snow stopped. Light poured through the cracks in the barn boards. The wolf stirred, lifting its head. Thomas spoke quietly. "You made it, didn't you?" The wolf blinked, ears twitching to the distant sound of another howl, somewhere high in the mountains. And in that fragile morning silence, man and wolf shared the same air, the same fear, the same exhausted peace. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single act, one man's decision to save what he once feared, would echo across the entire valley. The barn smelled of hay, kerosene, and fear. Thomas Reed hadn't slept since the storm began. He sat beside the heater, boots caked with snow, staring at the wolf that now lay curled on a pile of straw meant for lambing season. Its breathing was shallow, steady, but strained. The wound on its leg looked angry and raw. Thomas poured a bit of antiseptic over the cut. The wolf jerked, snarling weakly, then went still again. "Yeah," Thomas murmured. "I'd growl too if someone poured this stuff on me." He tied a clean cloth loosely around the wound. The wolf's fur was thick silver gray, with a darker saddle along the back. In the dim light, it looked less like a monster and more like something sculpted from smoke and frost. Hours passed. Thomas boiled water on the portable stove, poured it into a bowl, and set it near the heater. The wolf's nose twitched, sensing the warmth. He spoke softly, mostly to himself. "I don't even know why I'm doing this. Maybe it was the silence of the valley. Maybe it was Eleanor's voice echoing in his head, the way she used to say, 'Mercy costs less than bullets.' Whatever the reason, he stayed." By morning, the snow outside had stopped. Light filtered through cracks in the wood, painting thin bars across the straw. The wolf stirred and tried to stand, trembling. Its paw slipped. It fell again. Thomas reached instinctively to help, then remembered what he was touching. He pulled back, muttering, "You've got to do this on your own, friend." The animal met his gaze for a moment, then rested its head back on the straw. Its tail, hesitant, uncertain, moved once. Not a wag, just a twitch, as if acknowledging the truce. That day, Thomas rationed his sheep feed, leaving a bit of raw meat on a pan near the heater. The wolf sniffed, crept forward, and ate without taking its eyes off him. Outside, the valley glistened white and still. The radio finally crackled to life. Roads closed until noon. Wildlife team delayed due to avalanche risk. Thomas exhaled. "Guess it's just you and me for another night." By the second evening, the wolf's breathing had steadied. It could lift its head, ears flicking at every sound, the clank of chains, the bleat of distant sheep, the whistle of wind slipping through the cracks. Thomas read aloud from an old newspaper just for the noise. He didn't know why. Officials say non-lethal methods reduce livestock losses by more than 90%. Huh. He glanced at the animal. Maybe they were right. When the lantern flickered, he reached over to adjust it. For a moment, his hand hovered inches from the wolf's muzzle. He could feel its breath, hot, wild, alive. He pulled back quickly. "Don't make me get attached," he whispered. The next morning brought visitors, not human ones. A magpie perched on the rafters, chattering. Through the cracked door, Thomas saw 3 sets of paw prints in the snow beyond the fence, fresh circling once, then disappearing into the woods. "The pack's looking for you," he said quietly. "You got family out there." The wolf limped to the door, sniffed ears, pricked. For a heartbeat, it looked every bit the creature it was born to be, alert, fierce, perfectly designed for this wild country. Thomas's chest tightened. He remembered a younger version of himself, angry at the sight of such prints, blaming every loss on them. Now, he wasn't so sure. He fetched the radio again. "County Ranger. This is Reed Farm, North Valley. I've got an injured gray wolf leg caught in fladry wire. She's alive, stable." Static. Then a faint reply. "Copy that. Team can reach you tomorrow morning. Hold position. Do not release or relocate." Thomas looked at the wolf. Tomorrow. One more day. That night, the temperature dropped to -15. The heater sputtered. The fuel was almost gone. Thomas bundled himself in an old coat and sat near the straw pile, humming low. The wolf shifted closer, not enough to touch, but close enough to share warmth. Hours later, a thud outside shattered the silence. The barn door shook. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and froze. 2 glowing eyes stared back from the dark. Another wolf. It stood at the edge of the yard, snow crusted on its muzzle. It didn't growl, it just watched, silent and still. The injured wolf raised its head, emitting a low, answering whine. Thomas whispered, So you're not alone after all. The wild visitor lingered for a few seconds, then disappeared into the white. He exhaled, heart racing. Somewhere deep inside, fear gave way to something else, awe. Dawn came pale and brittle. The rescue team hadn't arrived yet. Thomas stepped outside, scanning the horizon. Endless snow, no tire tracks. When he returned to the barn, the wolf was standing, limping but upright. It turned toward him, steady and silent. Thomas smiled faintly. "Looks like you don't need me much longer." The wolf tilted its head as if understanding. Then, without warning, it stumbled and nearly collapsed. He caught it by instinct, steadying its weight. For the briefest moment, his hand rested on its shoulder muscles, trembling beneath thick fur. Then the wolf straightened and pulled away, choosing dignity over dependence. Thomas nodded once. Fair enough. Outside, wind carried the faint sound of another howl, distant waiting. He whispered, "Soon." And as he watched the animal rest again under the golden light of dawn, Thomas knew this wasn't just survival. It was a quiet kind of forgiveness, written in paw prints and patience. The morning began like any other clear sky wind, soft as breath across the valley. By noon, that breath had turned to heat. The smell of smoke reached the ranch before Thomas saw the flames. He was fixing the southern fence when the wind shifted, carrying a plume of gray over the ridge. Within minutes, the radio crackled wildfire near Baker Creek. All residents prepare for possible evacuation. Thomas looked toward the barn. The wolf, still limping, but stronger now, paced restlessly. The pack's howls echoed faint and distant from the high country. He whispered, "You can smell it too, huh?" Ash began to fall like snow. By evening, the ridge glowed red. The fire moved fast, fed by wind and dry grass. Thomas loaded what he could into his truck, fuel cans, tools, feed. But the sheep, hundreds of them, crowded the lower pasture, terrified by the scent. He had no time to move them all. The power went out. The valley roared with wind. Flames crawled down the slope like living things. The air burned his lungs. Thomas ran to the barn. The wolf was awake, Hackle's raised eyes fixed on the ridge. When Thomas opened the door, it didn't retreat. It stared straight past him toward the pasture. For a moment, he thought the animal might bolt. Instead, it turned back toward him and gave a short, sharp bark, almost like a command. He followed its gaze. The sheep. Thomas grabbed his coat, coughing through smoke. "All right," he rasped. "Let's do this together." They ran. Out in the open, the fire's glow painted the sky blood orange. The flock had split, some pushing against the fences, others bolting uphill where the danger was worse. Thomas shouted, waving his arms. His guard dogs barked and circled, trying to turn the herd. Then through the chaos came a sound he didn't expect, a low rising howl cutting through wind and panic. The wolf. The animals froze. Every sheep's head turned toward that voice, ancient and commanding. Thomas took the moment. He whistled sharply, driving them toward the safe canyon where irrigation lines formed a barrier of damp ground. The wolf loped alongside, limping but tireless, herding from the other side, like she'd done it all her life. Flames leapt across the upper slope. Sparks rained down. Thomas's sleeve caught an ember. He slapped it out. The wolf coughed, eyes gleaming through smoke. They reached the canyon's mouth as a gust sent fire over the ridge. Thomas opened the irrigation gates, water surged, flooding the trench. He drove the sheep inside, shouting until his voice broke. Then he turned and saw the wolf still outside, trapped behind a collapsing fence. Damn it! He sprinted back, heat blistering his skin. The wolf whined, paw tangled again, this time in broken, fladry wire, half melted by fire. He yanked at it, ignoring pain as sparks stung his hands. The wire snapped. The wolf stumbled free, and together they dove through the mud as a burning beam crashed behind them. Water hissed. Steam filled the air. When Thomas opened his eyes, they were both alive, soaked, shaking, lying side by side in the shallow ditch. The fire swept past, roaring overhead, but sparing the canyon. He coughed, laughed once, then fell silent. The wolf stood first, shaking off ash. It looked down at him, eyes reflecting both flame and moonlight. He whispered, "Guess we're even now." By dawn, the ridge was blackened. The valley smoked like a dying forge. Thomas rose slowly, every muscle aching. Around him, the flock grazed nervously on wet soil. The wolf limped to the edge of the canyon and howled. Another answered from far, far away. Thomas felt something break loose inside him, a weight he hadn't realized he carried. All the anger, all the fear that had ruled his life, burned away with the ridge. He looked at the animal and said softly, "Go home." The wolf lingered uncertain. Then it stepped closer and touched its muzzle briefly against his sleeve, just a brush, quick as wind, before turning toward the mountains. For a long time, Thomas watched until the gray shape disappeared into the pines. He didn't cry, but when the silence returned, it felt different, no longer empty, but alive. Days later, firefighters declared the blaze contained. News crews came filming the Black Hills and the ranch that somehow survived. Maria Santos from the Wood River Wolf Project arrived in a dust-covered truck, shaking her head in disbelief. "You saved the whole herd," she said. Thomas shrugged. "Didn't do it alone." She smiled gently. "We heard reports. One of the wolves stayed behind during the fire." That true Thomas looked toward the ridge where new green shoots were already pushing through ash. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe she was just reminding me what partnership means." That evening, as the sun dropped behind the sawtooths, the valley shimmered gold again. Thomas rebuilt the fence, leaving the fladry ribbons in place, not as warning, but as memory. Each red flag fluttered softly in the wind like an old truce renewed. He paused, hands resting on the post, listening. Far in the distance, a single howl rose steady, clear, strong. He smiled. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting nature. Sometimes it's about remembering we're part of it. The fire left scars across the valley, black streaks cutting through gold grass and memory alike. For Thomas Reed, it left questions too, the kind that didn't burn away easily. In the days after, word spread fast. Neighbors arrived with shovels and coffee, patting him on the back for saving his flock. The story of the old rancher who outran the fire traveled faster than smoke. But then someone added a detail that changed everything. They said he hadn't been alone. By the end of the week, a county truck pulled into his driveway. Two officers stepped out, one from Idaho Fish and Game, the other from the Forest Service. Behind them stood Maria Santos' clipboard, in hand, her expression calm but unreadable. "Mr. Reed said the taller officer we've received reports you had direct contact with a wild gray wolf during the fire." Thomas exhaled. "If you're asking whether she was there, yes. But I didn't plan it that way. Did you handle the animal physically?" He hesitated. "I freed her from wire, treated a wound, and let her go." The officer scribbled. "That qualifies as illegal possession of a protected species, even temporarily." Maria stepped forward quickly. "Hold on. The situation was an emergency. He prevented harm to livestock and wildlife." The officer nodded, still writing. "We'll file a report for review. No fines yet, but he'll need to attend a compliance hearing." When they left, Thomas stood on the porch watching their taillights fade. He wasn't angry, not exactly. More like hollow. He whispered to the empty air, "Good deeds don't always pay in this world." The following week, the hearing took place in town. Inside the small county hall, the air smelled of dust and old wood. A few ranchers sat in the back, arms crossed. At the front, a banner read, "Community Forum Wolves and Coexistence." Maria spoke first, projecting calm authority. She presented data from the Wood River Wolf Project. Since 2008, over 100 ranchers have participated in non-lethal deterrence. Livestock losses remain under 1% annually. Mr. Reed's actions prevented both animal suffering and property damage. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then, a familiar voice rose. Hank Miller, Thomas's longtime neighbor. "So, what now?" Hank said, leaning forward. "We're supposed to thank wolves for not eating us. That thing could have killed him." Thomas turned. "She didn't. That's luck, not proof." The room erupted in whispers. The moderator banged a gavel. "Please keep order." Thomas stood slowly, removing his hat. His voice was low but steady. "I spent my whole life hating wolves. Thought they were nothing but trouble. But when the fire came, that wolf didn't take my sheep. She helped me save them." He paused, scanning the faces. Farmers, scientists, reporters. "I'm not saying we should feed them or pet them. I'm saying maybe it's time we stop treating them like enemies. They belong here as much as we do." Silence. Then Maria added softly, "Coexistence doesn't mean surrender. It means understanding." The moderator cleared his throat. "Noted. The board will review and issue recommendations." When Thomas stepped outside, the evening air felt lighter. Reporters snapped photos asking for quotes. He ignored them all and looked toward the dark line of mountains where he knew the pack still roamed. Days turned to weeks. The investigation ended quietly. No fines, just a written warning and an invitation to join the Wood River Project officially as a rancher partner. Maria delivered the news herself. "You're not in trouble," she smiled. "You're being recruited." Thomas chuckled dryly. "Never thought I'd live to be called a wolf advocate." "You earned it," she said. "The valley needs people like you folks who've seen both sides." He looked across his pasture where the new fladry lines fluttered like ribbons of truce. "I'll think about it." But deep down, he already knew his answer. 1 week later, he attended his first training session. Younger volunteers showed him how to use motion-activated lights, noise boxes, and GPS tracking collars that helped monitor wolf packs. He listened more than he spoke, studying the maps that marked territories and migration routes. Maria pointed to one green dot near the ridge. "That's her, the female from your property. We collared her 2 days ago. She's healthy." Thomas stared at the map, eyes tracing the wolf's slow path north. "She made it," he whispered. "Yes," Maria smiled. "Because of you." He nodded, quiet. "No. Because she reminded me who I was supposed to be." That night, Thomas returned home to find a message taped to his gate. "Thank you for saving our valley." No signature. Just a handprint smeared with ash, maybe from one of the firefighters, maybe from a neighbor. He smiled, folding the note into his pocket. The next morning, he set out early to check the fence lines. The wind carried a familiar sound, faint howling from the mountains. Only this time, he didn't hear danger. He heard home. Spring came late that year. The snows melted slow, revealing blackened earth and green shoots pushing through the scars. Life had returned to the Wood River Valley, cautious, quiet, beautiful. For Thomas Reed, every morning felt like a small beginning. He fixed fence posts, reseeded pasture, and met with new volunteers from the project. He wasn't the same man who once cursed the howls beyond his land. Something in him had shifted, not softened exactly, but widened. Still, one thing remained undone. The wolf, the gray female he had rescued, was out there somewhere in the northern range, and now the project wanted to relocate her to a protected zone farther east. Maria Santos came to tell him herself. "They'll move her next week," she said gently. "It's safer. Fewer roads, more elk." The collar shows she's been circling near your property again. Thomas felt the words settle in his chest. She came back, looks that way. Maria nodded. Maybe she's saying goodbye. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stepped outside with a lantern listening. The valley was still, except for the murmur of wind through the cottonwoods. Then, faint, far off, a single howl answered the silence. It wasn't warning or hunger this time. It was something else. Recognition. Thomas lowered the lantern. "All right, girl," he whispered. "If you're out there, I'll see you off myself." The morning of the relocation was pale and windless. A wildlife team set up near the ridge tranquilizer rifles, ready a transport crate marked IDW-27. Thomas arrived in his truck hat low against the glare. Maria handed him a pair of binoculars. "There," she said, pointing toward a line of aspen trees. Through the glass, he saw her strong again leg, healed fur silver in the sunlight. She stood on a rise overlooking the valley, tail lifted high, watching the people below, but not afraid. "She remembers you," Maria whispered. Thomas swallowed hard. Or maybe she just remembers the barn. When the dart hissed through the air, the wolf leapt once startled, then sank gracefully into the grass. The team rushed forward. Thomas followed, heart pounding. They checked her vitals, adjusted the collar, loaded her gently into the crate. Maria looked at him. "Do you want to say something before we go?" He stepped closer, crouched beside the crate. The wolf's eyes were half open, calm. "You don't belong behind any fence," he said quietly. "Not mine, not theirs. You taught me that." He rested a calloused hand against the metal. "Go where the wind still remembers your name." Hours later, the truck rolled east toward the mountains. Thomas drove behind for a while until the road split one way back home, one way into wilderness. He stopped at the junction engine, idling. For a long moment, he just sat, hands gripping the wheel. Then he smiled. "You'll find your pack." He turned toward home. Weeks passed. The valley warmed. Wildflowers painted the fields. Life settled again into rhythm. Dawn chores, long rides, quiet evenings. Yet sometimes when the wind blew from the east, he thought he heard an echo, a howl threading through the cottonwoods. One evening, as he fixed the last broken fence post, Maria's truck pulled up. She waved a folded report. "She's doing fine," Maria said, smiling. "Tracked her 200 miles north, integrated with a new pack." Thomas exhaled slowly. "Good, she deserves that." Maria hesitated. "You know, we're naming her after the valley Reed female. You don't mind?" He laughed softly. "I suppose that's fair. She earned the name more than I did." They stood together, watching the sunset pour gold over the pasture. The red, fladry lines fluttered gently in the wind. Maria said, "You kept them up." "Yeah," Thomas nodded. "Not to keep anything out, just to remind me where the line used to be." They shared a quiet moment. Then she drove off, leaving him with the sound of crickets and distant thunder rolling across the hills. That night a storm gathered, brief cleansing full of spring rain. Thomas sat on the porch listening to the rhythm against the roof. Somewhere beyond the valley, a wolf howled again. It wasn't farewell anymore. It was part of the song of the land. He closed his eyes. "Good night, old friend." The rain softened. Lightning flashed once, illuminating the valley below, green, alive, unbroken. And in that light, Thomas finally understood, letting go wasn't loss. It was the purest form of love. Summer returned to Sun Valley with a gentleness no one expected. The hills that once burned were green again. Wildflowers lined the creeks, and the air smelled of sage after rain. Thomas Reed walked his fields each dawn, boots sinking in dew, the soft bleating of sheep trailing behind him. The world had changed, and so had he. The red, fladry lines still fluttered around his pastures, not as barriers, but as ribbons of memory. To strangers, they looked like decoration. To Thomas, they were promises, a reminder that peace wasn't something you waited for, it was something you built, one choice at a time. Since the relocation, the project had grown. Younger ranchers were joining farmers who once laughed at the idea of coexistence. They came to learn to listen, to see for themselves that fear could give way to balance. Maria often visited clipboard in hand boots, muddy a grin that carried the weight of long days in the field. Losses this season, she'd ask. Thomas would tap his notebook. 1 lamb, probably coyote. Less than 1% like you said. She'd smile. You're proof it works. He'd shrug, glancing toward the distant ridges. No. The wolves proved it. I just stopped fighting what I didn't understand. That autumn, the Wood River Project held a small community gathering a celebration of the valley's recovery. Banners hung between cottonwoods. Kids painted cardboard cutouts of wolves and sheep side by side. The smell of roasted corn and coffee drifted through the air. When Maria stepped up to the microphone, her voice carried across the field. Coexistence isn't perfect. It takes patience, vigilance, and humility. But every success begins with someone willing to see the world differently. Tonight, we honor that courage, the courage to change. Then she called Thomas to the stage. The crowd clapped, some familiar faces, some new. Thomas removed his hat and looked at them, ranchers, volunteers, park rangers, scientists. Once, he would have seen only lines dividing them. Now he saw a circle. He spoke slowly, words careful and plain. I used to think strength meant protecting what's yours. Turns out real strength is knowing what to let go of. He paused, then smiled. Turns out wolves make better neighbors than I ever imagined. Laughter rippled through the crowd, gentle knowing. That night, as twilight painted the valley blue, Thomas lingered long after the others left. Lanterns swung softly from the trees. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes yipped, and beyond them, faint but clear, a wolf answered. He turned toward the sound, heart steady. Maria approached quietly beside him. She's still out there, she said. The caller pings once a week. She's leading her own pack now. Thomas nodded. Good. That's how it should be. They stood in silence a moment, listening to the chorus of wild voices threading through the night air. Then Maria said softly, You know, we used to call this land the conflict zone. Now we call it the coexistence corridor. Thomas smiled. Has a better ring to it. Weeks later, the first snow fell again, thin, glittering soft as breath. Thomas sat on the porch, cup of coffee, steaming, watching flakes drift over the hills. A movement caught his eye near the tree line, a gray shape against the white. Too large for a coyote, too fluid for a dog. He raised his binoculars. A wolf stood there. Not close, but close enough to see the silver streak along her back, the mark he remembered from the barn. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The wolf lifted her head. Their eyes met across the frozen distance. Then she howled. Long, low, beautiful. And before the echo faded, another voice joined hers, smaller, higher pitched. A pup. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He didn't move, didn't breathe. When the wolves vanished into the snow, he exhaled slowly, a quiet laugh escaping. You did it, he whispered. You kept the song alive. That night, he wrote a letter to the project to be read at the next meeting. I once thought the land belonged to me. Now I know I belong to it. Every creature here, every howl and heartbeat is part of the same story. Thank you for reminding me how to listen. He signed it simply, Thomas Reed, Sun Valley Ranch. When dawn broke, the sky was the color of ash and gold. The wind carried a faint echo from the mountains, not haunting this time, but hopeful. And as light spilled over the valley, it seemed the land itself exhaled, healed, whole, alive again. When people talk about wolves, they often speak of fear. But fear is only the first page of the story, never the ending. In Sun Valley, one man learned that protecting life isn't always about drawing lines or building fences. Sometimes it's about crossing them. Thomas Reed began as a rancher at war with the wild. He ended as a witness to what coexistence can look like when compassion leads the way. The Wood River Wolf Project didn't erase conflict, it transformed it. Through science, patience, and empathy, an old valley found new rhythm: red flags instead of rifles, shepherd dogs instead of traps, voices instead of silence. And in that rhythm, something remarkable happened. The land itself healed. Predators returned to keep elk herds balanced. Grasslands thickened. Streams ran cleaner. The same howl that once symbolized danger became the sound of balance restored. Thomas used to say, "You can't reason with hunger." Now he'd correct himself. You can reason with respect. What the story of Wood River reminds us is simple. Nature doesn't need our permission to survive. It needs our partnership. The line between us and the wild was never meant to divide. It was meant to guide. Every rescue, every act of restraint, every moment we choose understanding over fear adds another thread to that fragile bridge between worlds. For Thomas, the wolf was never his enemy. She was his teacher. She taught him that strength is not control, but coexistence, not dominance, but dignity. And in the